minutes before the next session.
Thank you. And Asker, you will.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Asker Brynjar Torfason, a long time fan of the Money View, and I'm very honored to be chairing this panel, which is the last on the 3 days agenda before Perry will wrap it up and the brainstorm session. So the idea now is to have some lively discussion and not any presentation or heavy material. So we selected two of the, I would say, at least in my view, two of the most funniest money viewers, Dan Neilson and Izabella Kaminska. And for those of you who don't know, I have a brief introduction, but I assume most of you know, Dan has already been talking in the previous days. But first time I heard of him, he was a PhD student of Perry when they two had this Money View blog on the INET website with the blackboard drawings of T accounts. So this goes more than 10 years back, predating the YSI. But he is now a professor at Bard College in Simon's Rock, and he presents himself as a monetary economist specializing in the structure of the monetary and financial system. And as you heard yesterday, he's the author of Minsky, and running the blog Soon Parted, where you can find a lot of material linked to what we're going to discuss today. And then the other panelist, Izabella Kaminska, whom I started reading on the FT Alphaville blog even before I could afford to pay the subscription. It used to be open, so excellent for students. And I think for almost a decade, she has been the editor there. Before that, she was on CNBC, Reuters, and other media platforms. But just recently, she launched the Blind Spot. And I'm going to use the opportunity to maybe paste some links into the chat afterwards when they start talking. And so this is a new media, financial media service platform, but I thought it was very well selected name, the Blind Spot, because trying to link this, also this whole symposium of 3 days and the previous one year ago, and actually the initial plenary of the YSI in Budapest 2016, Perry had this short video presentation or short presentation that is now recently on YouTube video, and I will post that link as well, about how money is the blind spot in economics. With this short introduction of these guys and maybe linking it to the previous discussion, we were acting on accounting of the SDR. So we might come back to that in the ending, but this is quite important in my view, because the accounting of central banks as well is where the clearing and actually the money market between the banks happens, at least from the view where I studied it in Sweden. And actually the interbank market was created when the central bank updated their accounting system. So I think we are kind of approaching here from several aspects, the importance of digital accounting, and then the view of what is money. And here I think it's very important to also link it to the panel we had yesterday about CBDC from the, about cryptocurrencies from the practitioner's perspective, because we heard yesterday they were calling for more regulation, and we see, I think it was exactly 1 year ago, Izabella had a piece in the FT when Bitcoin was around 50,000 or something. And then BlackRock, which we had on the fire chat yesterday, were starting to enter this area. So we have very many touching points, but the focus of this panel is still the CBDC and crypto. The questions I was thinking, is CBDC a crypto for grown-ups? This is taken from a book that I recently started reading, a Payoff, which is authored by actually a financial journalist and former CEO of the SWIFT system, and who is now with CLS Bank. But the other view of that is that, can we even have a CBDC without crypto? In the banking system of the central banks, and take it through some other more traditional formats, and avoiding the crypto thing. So I throw up the ball with these two different perspectives, but then we'll see where the discussion goes. So maybe, Izabella, great to have you. If you can give your thoughts on this.
So thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. It's funny that you mentioned the blind spot thing, because the coincidence, because if I recall, this isn't the first time I've had a Vulcan mind meld with Perry. There was some other term that he massively publicized, which I'd actually arrived on independently. I think he thought I was citing him without credit, and actually I had just also arrived upon it independently, and then I realized he had a whole thing about it. Can't remember now which phrase it was. So we're obviously somehow synced in space and time, Perry. But that makes sense because I'm a big fan. Anyway, so is CBDC a crypto for adults? Now, my take is still the same as it's been for a long time, which is I still don't really understand what problems CBDC is trying to solve, other than maybe making the system more full reserve-y. I don't think it solves the inclusion issue. Like you hear from the central banks, well, we're creating a public good because we need a public good. Digital money can't just be in the hands of like Libra or Bitcoin or crypto. But I'm not really convinced by that argument, especially when you see the rollout of CBDCs in places like, I think it was Nigeria, where you see there's been no actual change in terms of inclusivity. The tiering of the CBDC in terms of how much information you need to give up to be using it is pretty, it echoes the formal banking system anyway. So I'm still a little bit confused as to what really the solution, like what problem is the CBDC solving, other than giving the central bank more control over money multiplier and on a full reserve basis, and possibly competing with banks for funding. Yeah, so is it, and also I just think a lot of it is to do with central banks wanting to be relevant, having everybody wants to look like they're modernizing and trying to improve services. RTGS as it stands is clunky, I'm sure, and needs investment, and it's always good to have a narrative to attract more money into rebuilding things. I'm not saying we shouldn't rebuild things. I'm just a little bit, I'm not sure it's that transformational. Where it is transformational is in the monetary policy side of things. So that's my quick take.
Okay, I'm hoping for Dan to be maybe a little bit on some other view. Just a quick note, first time I heard about it was from the Swedish Riksbank, the oldest central bank in the world. They made e-krona report in 2016, I think, and yeah, and then there were some talks of this was to make the cashless society, and then even some voices were saying this is to impose a negative interest rate on the money holding. But now when we are in the inflationary area, I mean, that argument has at least fallen. But Dan, what's your take on this and what Izabella said?
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. Good to be talking to you. Thank you, Izabella, I, of course, have followed your writing in the FT for some time and now on the Blind Spot. And I'm not sure that we're going to have, that the two of us are going to sharply disagree during this conversation. I think basically we share a perspective. I agree. I think at this moment, there isn't really a very well-defined argument in favor of a CBDC, but instead there does seem to be a set of political economic circumstances pushing in from different angles, but maybe adding up to enough motivation that the central banks want to keep experimenting so that they might be ready rather than get outmaneuvered. So, for example, clearly the success that, you know, the massive growth of crypto, the interest in crypto has changed over the last 2 years into something still not really a you know, taking a big bite out of the global dollar-based monetary system, but maybe enough intellectual interest and enough activity that central banks suddenly feel like there could be a risk to their ability to exert monetary control, and they're reacting with methodical steps, not panic really. It doesn't look like panic, but slowly taking one step at a time to push back. I can see that they are are feeling like in order to maintain control of the monetary system within the central banking sphere, that they feel that they need to learn from what cryptocurrencies have figured out, and so they need to have something ready. But you can see that different central banks are approaching it actually quite differently. So China's ECNY is fairly advanced for a large country with a big population and a big financial system. They've come quite a long way into actual relatively public trials. Other places like the Riksbank that you mentioned, Asker, have prototypes and experiments, but maybe are not so far advanced. I would note, you know, in the US now, finally some concrete things are happening. An important moment in this debate, which I haven't seen many people following. A legal scholar, Saule Omarova, legal scholar, Cornell Law, I believe, you know, wrote a great paper, which people should have a look at, especially in this audience, The People's Balance Sheet. And Omarova really imagined really thoroughly remaking the Fed's balance sheet with CBDCs on the liability side and credit directly to the public on the asset side, really taking the bank, making the case for really using CBDCs to take the banks out of the credit mechanism. And she was nominated for comptroller of the currency by the Biden administration recently, and her nomination was dismissed very, very quickly. And you could say the Biden administration did not put up too much of a fight. So I think what that says is that this is going to happen. Whatever happens will be slowly, and it is likely to not be a revolutionary change with respect to the banking system as we have it now, and much more likely to be a technological incremental development over time and within the context of the existing institutions.
But okay, but then I have followed both, and probably Izabella as well, the CBDC discussion in the English Parliament. There is a report from Bank of England, and I also watched Christine Lagarde in discussion with the European Parliament with the digital euro, and there have been quite like fast-moving events happening in those fields. So would you agree, Izabella, this is going to happen slowly, or can you see like that the CBDCs was speeding up when we saw the Facebook Libra that was name changed to DM and is now up for sale from Meta? So they seem to be exiting from it. But on the other hand, in China, where we had the both Alipay and the WeChat Pay, and then the People's Bank of China stepping in quite fast and implementing it now through the even the Winter Olympics, where they were going to promote it and test it out. I mean, is this like, do you see it linked, or do you see it totally separate, and even a crypto collapse and a move to stable coins happening totally separately and independent of what's happening with CBDC, or is there a link from the journalistic perspective?
I mean, I think at the moment it's quite, there are lots of different things happening at different speeds. I think the big trend is that the regulators have finally woken up to crypto. I'm surprised it took them this long. And it seems like this will be the year that we'll get some proper clarity on regulation in the crypto space, and there will be some constraints. Now, at the same time, I'm sort of seeing reports that BlackRock are, considering offering crypto trading, which I find very surprising, because Ruffer's dalliance in the crypto market was met with, from what I understand, some scorn from the FCA, and they were sort of allegedly told, well, you did it this time, but like, give us a heads up if you're going to do that sort of thing again. And I think when Ruffer moved, everybody in the kind of serious asset management, real money space was like, how did you manage to get away with that? So the fact that BlackRock is still pushing ahead is indicative of something. And I suspect it's the convergence with the regulatory move, right? So as crypto gets cleaned up, BlackRock will move in, the institutions will move in. But if it gets, my view is, if it gets cleaned up, like it undermines its selling point. Like, cleaned up crypto is basically just conventional money. And I don't really see what, I mean, apart from being like potentially an asset class for speculation in its own compartmentalized way, like FX would be, but I don't see what the offer is. I think it all becomes a branding exercise. It's all very, for me, it's it undermines the whole concept, right? So that's my view on crypto. On CBDCs in China, well, yeah, there was a big, everyone has been concerned about China moving ahead before everybody else. I agree with, I think, some other names in this room that undermining the dollar standard, the dollar with just by launching a CBDC yuan, I don't think that's going to be, I don't think that's going to cut it. I don't think people are going to go, oh yes, now I'm going to use the yuan because it's a CBDC. I don't think that's the selling point. I think if anything, the data surveillance side of the CBDC makes it even more kind of creates more of a friction on that side of things. Like I don't think it will necessarily be, it might be convenient, but I don't think necessarily it will overcome these other issues. On the ground, people I know who are at the Olympics say they haven't seen it anywhere. So it seems like there's a massive disconnect between the PR and the reality on the ground, which is nobody's using it. I mean, perhaps you guys have different sources, but my sources, which are quite obvious really, because they pertain to people I know from my old paper there, but they haven't seen it on the ground. So I suspect, I reckon the regulatory situation is going to convert, like crypto is going to converge with conventional money, and then the CBDC will come in mostly as a branding exercise to make central banks look like they're cool and hip and on board with technology, but it will just be a smokescreen to update systems. The really big change, if it does happen, is if they move to like a full reserving system, which would be a big deal. And I'm not necessarily convinced that is good for anyone. So that's my take. I don't know if it really answers your question though.
I think I agree with most of what you just said, Izabella. I would say, I think a way to maybe we agree that there's not revolutionary change likely, and I think any push for full reserves I agree would be revolutionary, and I don't think it's likely, in part because it would be revolutionary. But one way we could maybe organize some of these observations is, I think that there are two related but also distinct conversations happening, which we could roughly call wholesale and retail. And the public crypto world, Bitcoin and Ethereum, to me, it seems like the days are numbered and the regulation is coming and people are going to lose their shirts either quickly or slowly. At the same time, there's a wholesale commercial conversation going on, which is more modest in the sense that there's not a whole lot of flash to it. And it's a little more honest in the sense that this is being done by people within the existing institutions who recognize that what we're talking about is database technology, and we're talking about how we manage account data and things like that. So it really doesn't sound and is not a revolutionary change in the monetary system, but it could be over time. It could add up to significant changes in the way the mechanics work, which rightly 99 days out of 100, 99 days out of 1,000 really don't matter. But on that other day, all of us are very busy. And so it would be helpful to understand what those mechanics are and whether there are new possibilities for instability, for example, is something I think we should focus on. So you see JP Morgan and Citibank, at the very least, I've looked closely. There were some other examples in Michel's presentation yesterday of various commercial experiments. You can't even quite call them crypto. They're not even always blockchain, but they're definitely working in that set of ideas and trying to figure out what could actually be useful. And I don't think that there are concrete answers yet. But so anyway, I think it's helpful maybe to note that there's a wholesale and a retail conversation to some extent playing out along different lines.
Yeah, and we have had wholesale central bank digital trading, at least in the countries in Europe, I know. But there are some people raising the hand. I'm planning like maybe 10 more minutes with Dan and Izabella, and then opening up the floor for questions. So Izabella, are you agreeing with Dan there? I'm trying to find some points.
I am agreeing, but I want to add like a little element to it, because yes, I do agree. I think the retail wholesale split is really important, and I do think on the wholesale side, that's where there's a lot of potential. And I know there was a bit of an SDR discussion in the break, and I do wonder to myself whether the concept of Bitcoin could be applied to the SDR side of things as a neutral middle ground from which more centralized systems like a spoke model descend from. And I think a worthy thing to consider in that context is the recent move that Biden is taking against the assets of the Afghan central bank, which he is supposedly going to redistribute to the victims of 9/11. Now, that may be moral and right, but I think it's a huge precedent. I think if there is going to be any disruption to the dollar standard, it's actions like that will possibly upset the idea that US custodians can be trusted from a central bank institutional perspective. Obviously, they have a duty to monitor terrorist funding and all that stuff, but this is a slightly different kettle of fish. And I think if that moves ahead, I worry about escalation. I worry about the victims of potentially US attacks saying, well, then we have a right to confiscate US assets. I mean, I'm just saying it starts a very concerning money grab situation in the world's different coffers and central bank systems. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. And that might be the pathway towards people on an international community basis agreeing to kind of move to a Bitcoin situation where your money can't be confiscated by a directive from Biden kind of thing.
Okay, so we are kind of moving up now towards the global, so above the CBDC that I see has to be linked to a specific central bank, and usually a national one, except we have the European one. So are we approaching a new? Do we need a new acronym? I mean, I was a bit confused yesterday in the practitioners discussion because there is a lot of new words used for something that looks very similar to me. So you start to call it stable coins when it's fully backed. And are you sure that it's fully backed with real dollars, or are there some? And you never know until the shit hits the fan, and that seems to be that some people in this room are expecting that. So maybe that's a good an official monetary policy tool that, you know, when discipline hits in, to use the money language, and you need to destruct money that has been created, and the fraud has to go. And are we going to see maybe that being contained in the crypto world and maybe having less effects on the real world then? And you know, I was doing my master's studies in Norway in 2001 when we had a huge bubble in tech and huge money created for that, and then a lot of it destroyed, but kind of the real economy survived quite well, and it was not such a big deal. So yeah, maybe take on that with a little bit of inflation aspects, and then moving towards the global IMF, SDR, CBDC, global digital money.
I mean, look, I think you made a number of interesting points there, Asger. One thing for everyone who starts to study this is that it's a little tiresome to have to read all of these crypto papers where these comp sci people feel like they have discovered something new, and most of the time, the majority of the time, they have made up their own new word for something that has existed for several hundred years at least. And so it's a lot of work to read these things and recover the words that we already had for the thing that they're talking about. But if you do that, and you know, I think the ways to do that are to bring them into the conversation, anyone who's willing to be patient and actually figure it all out. But then every once in a while they do come up with something actually new, and it's usually less new than they thought, but it's still maybe worth talking about. I don't see in what I've seen in the projects that really seem to have legs, I don't see any international system that actually displaces the dollar as the unit of account. So you see all of these multi-currency CBDC experiments organized kind of through the BIS frequently, and they're finding ways to exchange assets using distributed ledgers. But when you get into it, they are creating new ways to structure the exchange. And I think one of the big innovations is around programmability, you know, so being able to create conditional exchange according to pre-programmed logic, like an option that automatically exercises when it's in the money by a certain amount, or like a limit order, but potentially with very complicated conditions. So that's new, but it doesn't, I don't see it displacing the dollar as a whole. And to speak to Izabella's, you know, comment about the political economy of the Fed and the reserves of Afghanistan in particular, you know, to me that looks very much like you know, in the United States there's a deal between market and state where they both know their place and they don't get too far out of line. And to me, it seems very much like the market in that deal, the market is supposed to be able to call the shots. I'm not saying I think that's a good thing. I'm saying that seems to me like that's what the deal has been. And it does seem like if the state, if the US government the Treasury, Biden, start getting into the habit of confiscating those reserves, then yes, that could very possibly be something that pushes dollar dominance much more into question than it has been. And that, I think our viewpoint in this community would generally be that that's unlikely, given how entrenched the global dollar system is. But on the other hand, things can change fast when circumstances are right. I don't see that CBDCs per se are an avenue by which dollar dominance will be weakened, but I also am not sure. So we have to sort of follow it along.
Izabella, are you sure? Or
I mean, I don't really have very much to add. I kind of agree. I think there was something in the beginning I wanted to add on, but I've forgotten now. But no, I tend to agree with that assessment. I mean, this is awfully boring for you because we're in such terrible agreement.
but let me then add. I mean, the paper by Omarova and the discussions in the Parliament of Europe and England. I mean, money is always a political phenomenon, so you need some link between the democratic view and the central bank that's supposed to be acting on behalf of that state. And then when we go to the global arena, so I'm maybe coming towards closing our discussion, but there are some questions coming up in the chat as well. I mean, Robert McCarley mentioned that whether this would be getting closer to the cost bank, so linking it to the keynote of Perry of Kindleberger and the book of Dan about Minsky and Minsky's book about Keynes. I mean, are we seeing some kind of development in this direction, or not saying that history repeats itself, but rhyming, so that when we have a national CBDCs of all the central banks, we need some kind of a structure operated by BIS or someone else to link those together? Or is it just, totally irrelevant technological change going from bank tellers to ATMs, having robots handing out the money through machine, and just a technological transfer that's not going to change fundamentally the idea of money?
I think it really depends on what terms the CBDCs are issued. And we know that they're coming to market, that they have different ideas about how, so everyone might have access to some minimal amount with very little KYC and AML, but the larger transactions would be subject to an account-based system, right? And that is where it concerns me, because I don't think the central bank should be kind of, this is why I say what is the problem they're trying to solve, because they're going to have to do all the KYC AML themselves and or outsource it to other banks. But they're outsourcing it to other banks. You're back at square one to a certain degree, but within a full reserve system. That's the only difference, right? So I've always worried about that. And I worry about the cost bankification, as I call it, because if it goes full reserve, the issues are related to how those reserves are managed, how they get redistributed and recycled through the economy. And again, it's about whether you believe in a market-based system that can have like a variety of views, or a centralized system. And I don't think the centralized system is a good option. I think whatever efficiency that comes with it, the dangers of it are far too grave. And there is a reason why it might be more complex, and there might be more friction associated with the more decentralized or hybrid model, but it is worth it in the long run, because in a democracy, we don't want to have that awesome power. Yes, the central bank must influence the money supply, and it must have control to a certain degree, but it mustn't have total control, because it all comes back to the political economy side of things. And I think now you see, with the Biden thing, I think that is going to be more fundamentally important for the evolution of the international monetary system, than the CBDC concept itself, but also you see it within the current conversation about financing for all these different protests. And if we either exist in a world where we contain that, or we allow it to happen. And I think in a democracy, these are political economy, ethical questions. I wouldn't want this to go to technocrats to decide upon. I think it's a decision that has to be taken to the people. I think we have to educate and actually get the wider population involved in this conversation. And I'm surprised that that's not happening. And I think it should be. But yes, the Gosplan stuff really worries me, so much so that actually on my leaving page from the FT, they did a little chart where they said that after my departure from the FT, the references to Gosplan are going to go down in the FT quite substantially. There's going to be a Gosplan crash. So anyway, that's my fault.
Thanks. And we have the professor of international political economy, Perry, who has raised his hand. So that's maybe a good way to start opening up the
Well, I wasn't the first to raise hands. Are you?
No,
if you're, but maybe you would like me to be segueing.
Yes, there's a hierarchy there. Yeah.
So maybe I begin by taking issue with Dan's statement to begin with, that the central banks are moving methodically, not panicking. I've actually been rather impressed at how rapidly they're moving, because I think they don't like to move rapidly. And so there, a couple little data points to remember, that last summer they were promising a report on CBDC, but in September. Okay, and so I put it on my reading list, and I kept asking, where is it? Where is it? Okay, it finally came out just like a month or two ago. So there's a lot of scurrying behind the scenes and trying to get their line. And central banks don't like to do that. Okay, that's one little data point. Another little data point that no one was referenced just obliquely, and it might have slid by you if you weren't listening yesterday in the crypto, about New York banking regulations. Making various kinds of crypto arrangements basically illegal in New York State. Okay, well, this isn't just one state among many. This is the commercial banking center of the global dollar system. Okay, so there is an attempt to create at least a little safe space in New York State without getting the Fed's fingerprints on it, right? Because this is a state regulation. So I think the Fed's fingerprints are on everything, but it's indirectly. Who's signing? So the third data point. The Treasury put out this, thing on stablecoins. We're going to regulate stablecoins as if they were banks. Okay, that report that came before the Fed's report. Okay, and the BIS report on CBDC came like a month before the Fed's report on CBDC. So I see a systematic rollout of a tiered defense. This is a war fighting strategy where and so that's what I see when I look. I have no inside information. Let me assure everybody, I have less inside information than Izabella, most definitely. I read Izabella for inside information, and but I do pay attention, and I have a balance sheet view of the world, and I link the dots, and then I say, what's happening behind the scenes? Okay, not just with balance sheets, but with noticing these people all know each other and they're not referencing each other. They're talking in some room here, and I don't know where it is. So what are they afraid of? Okay, and I think here we should look more generally at the big actors in tech. Okay, certainly it was very clear to me that China was afraid of Alipay and WeChat. That was creating a separate payment system, a walled garden, that had a kind of independent reality. And the PBOC said, you know what? No. You know what? No, we're not going to do that. Okay. And we saw yesterday the Chinese students explaining how the Chinese CBDC is working. Okay. And I made a little comment there. Okay. I see every liability inside these third-party payment systems is now going to be convertible on demand into CBDC. Okay, discipline right there. You know, the central bank can do it itself, right? It can it can demand. So they're bringing these things under control and making them interoperable also, so that it's not going to be a competition between Alipay and WeChat. Okay, there's going to be par between these. Okay, and that's a very important thing. And I think the Fed is trying to do the same thing, however, responding to Facebook, you know, and Libra and that sort of thing, you know, so that's what I see as the actual threat that worries central bankers. Remember, they were worried about Bitcoin, not because it was a means of payment. You know, I don't think anyone who understands money was ever threatened by Bitcoin. But they did care about it because of KYC, you know, anti-money laundering stuff, which was very serious. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of problems there, and they used that to shut down crypto in New York. Right, that was the main argument, really. But I think they're worried about it more broadly, you know. And Facebook is getting its comeuppance in other dimensions as well, if you notice. And I think that's not an accident. Okay, it's not an accident. So watch that. I think that is the lines of defense, okay, are about, we're not going to have two governments. We're not going to have two payment systems. There's going to be one ring to rule them all.
I like that, the Lord of the Rings connection. And Perry is reading Izabella, and Izabella is reading Perry. So I like this, and I need to brag about that. I introduced them on the Copenhagen conference, and got to know Izabella through Twitter. So, you know, to the newcomers of the field, you know, follow things on Twitter, and maybe you meet people in real life after you met them on online conferences. But now we have a list. Macaulay has been commenting something on the chat. Feel free to jump in if you want, but I have Alex, Anush, and Larissa on the raised hand list. So Alex first, but be short because we have only 15 minutes left.
Yeah, so I haven't read the Saula Omarova paper. I probably should, but the idea of using retail CBDCs to bypass the commercial banking system, so regular people can kind of hold direct liabilities of the Fed or of the central bank and spend them. You know, that's interesting. I don't know if it's a good idea, but the question then is, you know, couldn't you do the exact same thing just by giving people retail deposit accounts at the central bank? And then we can ask, you know, like, is cash, what are the advantages of cash? And I think one of the main ones is that I can pay you, I can hand you, you know, some money, and you don't have to have an account anywhere. I can just hand it to you. And that kind of reminds me of, you know, when PayPal and Venmo first started out, and you could send money to an email address or a phone number, even if people didn't have an account at PayPal, and you'd get an email saying, hey, someone sent you money to your email address, sign up for PayPal now, or something like that. So just thinking, those are just kind of the thoughts that I was throwing out there. It's not clear to me that CBDC is necessary for any of the things that people are trying to use CBDCs for, even if those ideas are kind of bad ideas on their own anyway.
No, thanks. And I posted the link to Omarova's paper. It's called The People's Ledger, How to Democratize Money and Finance of the Economy. But Anush, let's take all three, and then Izabella and Dan will react. So Anush is next.
Thanks. Just on the CBDCs, I agree. It sort of looks like it's a solution looking for a problem, and it's motivated by fear. I always get excited when Perry talks political economy, because I enjoy that. But
because I never do.
The analytical question, it seems to me, that it raises is somewhat in addition to the political economy question. And that is, as we know from Perry, is that the credit system and the money system has to be a hierarchy, which means that it has to be both distributed and centralized simultaneously. So you can't, so retail CBDC doesn't make sense if it's a pathway to sort of Fed accounts, disintermediation, and so on, because you'll collapse the hierarchy. So why does it have to be a hierarchy? It has to be distributed for good old-fashioned Hayekian informational reasons, and it has to be centralized for the obvious reasons we know, scale payments, et cetera, et cetera. So it has to be both. It has to be centralized and distributed both. I think that's a distinct question from the ownership. I'm from India. The State Bank of India is a very large nationalized bank. It has 10,000 branches, and you can have a nationalized system that is hierarchical. But the Fed accounts idea, I think, does violence to the logic of hierarchy. And I think that's why it's a bad idea. Quite apart from, and so I have no brief for private banks. I think they should all be nationalized anyway, but it should remain a hierarchy, right? If you collapse the hierarchy, you're doing violence to, I think, a very major axiom of money. Indeed, and the proof of this is twofold, and I'll be very quick. One is that you see plans already with CBDCs to kind of add the tiering back in artificially, right? To kind of limit disintermediation. So they have to, if you didn't have tiers, you have to invent them. And what's happening in China is fascinating. What is happening in China is not Fed accounts collapsing the hierarchy. It's slotting in the platforms at one layer down in the hierarchy in order to discipline them. Right, so it's using discipline to create it's using CBDCs to create layers of hierarchy. So in both cases, hierarchy has been created. The one place where I think there is a decent function for CBDCs is in the wholesale space. And Larissa made this point in the chat, which I endorse. I don't know enough about global remittances, but I know that they're big, and I know that we in the global South pay a lot of money for them. I think there's something in the order of $500 billion a year. And so I think if there's a way to economize and cut out middlemen and just reduce costs in general for remittances, I think that is a potential use case for CBDCs. But that would be at another level of the hierarchy. Thanks.
Thanks, and Larissa, and then we wrap up.
All right, so of my two questions, I think Perry touched on the first one and Anush just did on the second. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking a third one. So amongst the wholesale BIS projects, there's different approaches. Some try to integrate every single central bank into the same system, the same like accounting system, and it seems like that allows like more distributed accounting, which may have some interesting implications to the hierarchy versus, and that seems to be the preferred approach between all of the emerging markets. And then you have the Europeans doing experimentation where there's more separation between like the ledgers, the accounting systems, and it's more around like creating linkages and ensuring interoperability between them. So I know, just wanted to get your thoughts on what we might see as the evolution, which model may we see become more prevalent, or just any reactions to the advantages of one versus another.
Excellent, thanks. Dan and Izabella, can you briefly react to the three comments because we have to wrap up now in the last in the coming 5 minutes or so, I think, but sure to be continued on the future symposiums, I assume.
I can. Izabella, I will offer you the choice of whether you want to go first or second.
I'll go second, if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you for all of those questions, and this has been a great series of discussions over the last couple of days. Obviously, we're asking more questions than we can answer. So thank you all for that, and I'll just do what I can in a couple of minutes. I've organized them hierarchically, I think. Alex, I think you're asking a question. The way I could synthesize your question is to say, do we actually need these for anything? And your starting point is that we probably don't. And I think that is right. I don't think anyone has actually proposed anything, a use for CBDCs that couldn't be done in another way. So that's not the logic of what's happening. The logic of what's happening, we have to look for somewhere else. And that might lead you to say, well, this is not a good idea at all because it's not the best way to solve anything. And again, you might be right, but I'm not sure that that is the logic of what, I don't think we get to choose about that. We're watching something that's bigger than any one idea or intellectual argument. Larissa, you're very, you asked several questions, and I'll speak here to the one that you spoke into the voice channel. I think this question of whether, you pointed out the multi-currency CBDC systems have a either we can sort of group them into one where they're trying to fit people together, and another, the European model, where they stay separate, but there's linkages between them. So I think what for us, maybe the question is, can we map those ideas expressed in what is genuinely new technological techniques, even if they're not totally new or not like obviously doing something totally different than what was done by older technologies. Even so, there are new systems for doing this. Do those create new financial roles or new forms for existing financial roles? Like, for example, if we have two distributed ledgers and somebody is in a position to destroy tokens in one and create tokens in the other, can we understand that as a dealing function? And if so, how can we understand where the dealer financing needs, which are very ancient in our understanding of the financial world, where do those fit into the new technology? That there is a genuinely new question, which is maybe a narrower question than many people have been looking for, but it's a very important question. And again, it will become, if we build these systems, then the day will come when that is the central question of the continuity of the financial system. So can we identify the roles? Perry, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I suppose in the end, does this count as quick, or does it count as methodical from the point of view of central banks? And maybe writing twice a week, I've gotten into a faster time scale so that things look slow to me, when in fact they should still be regarded as quick. So I don't really disagree with the substance of what you're saying, and I think it's just whose seat are you sitting in to make it look fast or slow. And I think you're quite correct that we can look to China, the political economy of the structure of the financial system, central bank trying to make sure that Alipay doesn't outmaneuver them. I think that's quite right. And so I wonder how a comparable political economy story might unfold in the United States, for example, where there is also a balance of power and a sort of agreement between the central banks and the regulators and the Treasury and the commercial banks. But it's a different deal than exists in China. And so what might roll out in that different political economic environment, to which maybe Anush's comment speaks in a bit. And Anush, you have characteristically asked a whole essay or maybe a whole book's worth of questions. So maybe I can speak mostly to the last point, which is about remittances, but remittances makes it sound like a very narrow and technocratic cost, when in reality what we're talking about, and I don't know that number, but if you cited 500 billion that the global South is paying for the privilege of accessing the global North, the payment system operated by the global North, that sounds entirely plausible and seems also very unfair. So it does seem that there's a real need for making the payment system operate in a less expensive way, and in particular less expensive to those who have been placed in the position of being least able to afford those expenses. Now, what technological solution does that lead us to, and what is the political economic impact of that technology? Well, that seems like a big conversation and an important one to have. And your observation that the hierarchy serves a function, maybe it serves the function of asking problems to be resolved at the lowest possible level so that small problems don't become systemic problems. that seems like a deep question, which we're familiar with in other contexts. And it will be up to us maybe to thread those observations into this conversation about CBDCs and crypto in a helpful way. And I guess last thing I'll say is that we're the ones who are able to do that because no one else can clearly, I think, jump between mechanics, financial innovation, financial instability, and the political economy of finance. If you look at this conversation, there's really not a lot of people who can do that. Plenty of individuals can do parts of that, but to have a group that can do all of those things at the same time, we're it, as far as I know. So thank you all for the questions and for the discussion. I'll hand it over to Izabella.
Thanks, Dan, for summing up also the 3 days in a good way of what needs to be done in the 3 coming years of symposiums. Izabella, we are very interested also if you address the 3 points, but also people want to know from the chat in more detail what's coming up with the blind spot, or what can we expect, and me being the first one to sign up to Dan Neilson Substack soon parted, I hope I was one of the early ones signing up to the blind spot, but yeah, if you can reveal something there, we were very interested at the end of this panel. Thanks.
Oh, well, conversation about media can go on forever, but very, very briefly, I am trying to, I mean, it's just a small thing. I'm trying to reconfigure how information is organized on the internet, but that's the low goal. The bigger goal is, no, I'm just joking. I have a feeling that like this feeds into central banking, because actually one of the things I'm trying to do at the blind spot is also rethink how we pay for content online. And I've been experimenting with developers, and it turns out there are all sorts of like inherent systems because of vested interests that make sure that the way we collect payments in the content world are focused around entrapment, data collection, blah, blah, blah. I was like, I just want time blocks. I just want people to pay for my stuff and be able to walk away after 24 hours. It turns out the entire industry is set up to try and like make sure that doesn't happen. Not because it can't technically happen, but because the incentives are so focused on predictable cash flows are the way. That's your future. I'm like, no, I want to work for my money. I want to be not complacent. I want, you know, but then you'll have seasonality in your cash flow. I was like, okay, fine, that's fine. This is the sort of mentality that we see. And I actually think, so I'm going to broaden it out for the closing point, is I kind of think what's happening is that finance was always an abstraction of the physical world, right? And we, you know, it was supposed to kind of simulate what's going on so that we can make better decisions into how we allocate resources and goods and blah, 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 to maximize freedom, happiness, all these other great things, right? And we do that in different sort of geopolitical, political economy ways. I think the internet has come along and added a secondary level to that abstraction. And it's now, because in a globalized system, we kind of converged everything and all the different values in terms of how we operate. So all this is like in a big hodgepodge, which is where the hierarchy of money is getting very confused, because nobody knows what rules, you know, there's one overwhelming like tendency to converge to a singular rule system. But actually, I think the system is wanting to develop competing value systems and competing hierarchies, or at least competing rules. As an example, I see it as a spectrum. On one side, you've got like the total anarchic state of Bitcoin, best illustrated by the disastrous tale of the HMS Satoshi, the independent, you know, free floating sovereign state that they tried to build. And it was a disaster. And one of the reasons it was a disaster, because it turns out that total anarchy isn't very good for like figuring out how to you know, distribute resources and take care of, you know, you need some rules, right? On the other end, you've got like complete total centralized Gosplan. Everything is, you know, there is hardly any freedom. Everything is pre-prescribed. It's the Borg model, right? In the middle, there are all these different potential systems where there's different balances of freedom and anarchy. And I think the internet is coming along and creating different virtualizations of how these systems can operate, and when it's better to kind of flip from one to the other in different sort of contexts. Because if you look at it, all the different platforms are converging around the very same functionality, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Eventually, like, the only thing that's going to differentiate them in about 5 years is the values of the different platforms and the community rules. And that's how money is going to be organized. I think it's going to be value centered. What are your values? How much freedom you tolerate? What sort of rules, you know, where your boundaries lie on all these different issues. And that is going to be the future of money. And I think CBDCs are just one aspect in this spectrum of different models we're going to be experimenting with. And it'll be, in my vision, I think it will be a continuous kind of rebalancing as one system works better than the other in a sort of metaverse. I mean, I'm fairly cynical about the metaverse, but I think it's one potential, like, useful kind of application is in virtualizing economic models, so we don't have to live through them. We don't have to go through like communism and why it was bad. We can just simulate it in the metaverse and figure out, oh, well, if you apply that rule to these circumstances, it's not going to work very well, but this one might, you know. So that's my I'm not sure how connected that was to central banks or the blind spot, but I think information and money wants to be organized around values again in this now current hodgepodge situation where everyone's confused.
Perfect. Thanks. And Perry raised the hand again before we will then close it up. So
I just want to draw a link between the last two remarks of between Dan and Izabella. So basically, Dan said ledgers are like currencies, and there's going to be a foreign exchange dealer of some kind that's going to be moving between them. Ledgers are like currencies. And what Izabella just said is platforms are like countries, you know, that they will be organized around sets of values. Okay, I think these two are saying sort of the same thing.
thanks. That's something good to end this with. And if I may, before we close the session, I always bring some books with me. I'm not sure if I can show them. I have to take off the background here. That while you are waiting for the book by Perry to come out, I wanted to show you the first Kindleberger book I read, Mania, Panics and Crises, actually the fourth edition in Norway 20 years ago. But this sixth edition has 30 pages on Iceland and across some 12 years ago. But then we are waiting for a new one. The forward here is by Soloff, and I'm kind of having the feeling that maybe Bob Macaulay will have with Bitcoin cryptocurrency forward in the upcoming later editions of it, hopefully. But then I also wanted to show you one of the first book my supervisor gave me, and Anastasia mentioned it in her feedback to Perry's keynote yesterday. And I think it's very relevant still today. This is 2007 book based on her PhD thesis and influenced my PhD thesis a lot. Fragile Finance, Debt, Speculation, and Crisis in the Age of Global Credit. I mean, it's all still relevant. And this is Minsky. This is where I heard first about Minsky. And then finally, the old book that has been mentioned before by Soros, The Alchemy of Finance, with a new preface and introduction by Paul Volcker in this old edition that I have. But just so you have plenty of both books and the blogs of Dan and Izabella, and maybe Perry will be starting to write some blog posts again. I'm hoping, if the book is sent to the printing office. But anyway, this is my final remarks on this fantastic panel. Thank you all for joining, and we stop the recording now and have